It was a cloudless Saturday morning when Thomas wandered into a neighborhood yard sale. Rows of forgotten items lay scattered across mismatched tables, their owners eager to part with the past for a few spare dollars. Thomas wasn't searching for anything in particular, but the thrill of uncovering treasures always drew him in. Amid the clutter of old lamps, chipped porcelain plates, and dusty books, his eyes fell upon an ornate mirror. Its frame was intricate, gilded with curling vines and roses, tarnished just enough to hint at its age. The glass was smooth and clear, yet something about it seemed to ripple under the sunlight as though it were alive. "How much for this mirror?" Thomas asked, lifting it carefully. The elderly woman behind the table froze, her weathered hands trembling as she glanced at the object. "That one," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It does not reflect the truth." Thomas chuckled. "Well, it's a mirror. What truth is there to reflect?" She didn't smile. Instead, her pale blue eyes darted nervously around as if expecting someone, or something, to overhear. "Take my warning seriously. That mirror has a way of taking things from you." He hesitated for a moment, but then shrugged. It was just an old mirror, nothing more. The woman's frail warning only added to its mysterious allure. He handed her a crisp bill, ignoring the way her fingers lingered over the money as though reluctant to complete the transaction. That evening, Thomas hung the mirror in his living room. It caught the dim glow of the lamps and reflected a warm, golden light that made his modest apartment feel elegant. He admired himself in its frame, grinning at his reflection. "Not bad, huh?" he joked to himself. But as the hours passed, he started to notice something peculiar. At first, it was subtle, a slight lag in the reflection. If he moved his arm, the mirrored version of him seemed to pause for the briefest moment before catching up. He attributed it to his imagination, perhaps the way the lighting played tricks on his eyes. By the second night, the delays were undeniable. He leaned forward, his nose almost touching the glass, and waved his hand in front of his face. His reflection mimicked him, but only after a heartbeat of hesitation. "Old mirrors can be quirky," he muttered, attempting to rationalize the strange phenomenon. Yet a cold unease settled in his chest. By the third night, Thomas began to dread the mirror. Its presence loomed larger than it had any right to. He avoided looking directly at it, but the feeling of being watched was inescapable. When he finally mustered the courage to glance at it, he was startled to see his reflection smirking, a sly, unsettling grin that he certainly wasn't making. His breath caught in his throat. "What the hell?" he whispered, stepping closer. His reflection moved with him, but the grin remained, mocking him. "Get a grip, Thomas," he muttered, forcing a laugh. He reached out and touched the glass, hoping the physical connection would ground him, would remind him that it was just a mirror. The surface was icy. Over the next few days, the reflection grew more independent. It blinked when Thomas didn't. It tilted its head as if studying him, its movements fluid and deliberate. And the grin, it returned often unbidden, like a predator sizing up its prey. One evening, as he sat on his couch staring warily at the mirror, his reflection leaned forward when he didn't. The sudden movement made Thomas jump. He stood abruptly, his pulse racing. The reflection stood too, but not in sync. "What do you want?" Thomas shouted at the glass, his voice trembling. His reflection only grinned wider. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. Every creak in his apartment, every shadow cast by the streetlights outside, seemed amplified. He closed his bedroom door, desperate to block out the mirror's unsettling presence. But sleep offered no escape. In his dreams, he was trapped on the other side of the glass, pounding on the barrier as his reflection. No, not his reflection, stood in his world, living his life. It laughed at him, a sound that echoed endlessly in the void. He woke in a cold sweat, his heart pounding like a drum. On the fifth night, the nightmare became reality. Thomas stood before the mirror, unable to resist its pull. His reflection looked different. Its eyes were darker, sunken, filled with malice. It no longer mimicked his movements at all. And then, without warning, it stepped forward. The glass rippled like water as the reflection emerged, its form solidifying in the dim light of the room. Thomas tried to scream, but no sound came out. He was frozen, his body unresponsive, as though invisible chains held him in place. The reflection, no, the thing, turned to him and smiled. "You had your turn," it said, its voice identical to his own but dripping with mockery. "Now it's mine." Thomas felt himself being pulled backward, his vision distorting as the world dissolved into darkness. He tried to fight, to resist, but it was futile. When his senses returned, he found himself staring out from the other side of the mirror. His apartment looked the same, but he was no longer a part of it. The thing that wore his face turned off the lights and walked away, leaving Thomas alone in the suffocating silence of the glass prison. His fists pounded against the surface, but no sound escaped. From the corner of the room, the elderly woman's warning echoed in his mind. It does not reflect the truth. Now Thomas understood. The mirror hadn't reflected him. It had taken him, and in his place something else was free. The sky was gray, the air thick with the scent of damp earth when Marissa stumbled upon the yard sale. An old couple had laid out their wares on rickety tables, their belongings bathed in the golden glow of a setting sun. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, just something to fill the empty corners of her new apartment. And then she saw it. The porcelain doll sat on a wooden chair, dressed in a faded blue dress, its delicate hands folded neatly in its lap. Its glassy eyes, once bright, were now dull with age, but something about them felt alive. Marissa wasn't fond of dolls, but this one had a strange pull. She picked it up, running her fingers over its cracked face. "How much?" she asked. The old woman hesitated, her hands wringing the edge of her apron. "That doll," she murmured. "She's been with us for a long time." The old man shot his wife a look, then turned to Marissa. $10, he said quickly. His wife stiffened but said nothing. Marissa handed over the cash. As she turned to leave, she heard the woman whisper, almost too softly to be real, "Don't let her out." A chill ran down Marissa's spine. She glanced back, but the woman had already turned away. That night, Marissa placed the doll on a shelf in her bedroom, away from her direct line of sight. Something about it unsettled her, but she shook the feeling off. It was just an old toy. As she lay in bed, half asleep, she heard it. A whisper. Soft, distant, almost part of the wind. "Let me out." Marissa's eyes flew open. She sat up, her breath coming in quick bursts. The room was silent. The doll sat motionless on the shelf, its head tilted slightly. Had it always been that way? She shook her head, laughing nervously. "You're losing it, Marissa." But she slept with the light on. The next morning, the doll was no longer on the shelf. It was on her bedside table. Marissa froze. The air felt thick, charged with something unseen. She reached out slowly, hesitating before touching the doll. It was cold. Had she moved it in her sleep? No, why would she? Trying to ignore the unease creeping up her spine, she placed the doll back on the shelf. But that night, as she drifted off to sleep, the whisper returned. "Let me out. Clearer this time. Closer." Marissa sat up, heart hammering in her chest. The room was empty, but the doll now sat on her desk, facing her bed. It was watching. She grabbed the doll, shoving it into her closet and slamming the door shut. "Enough," she muttered, crawling back under the covers. But sleep did not come easy. The next night, the whispering grew louder. "Let me out." The closet door rattled. Marissa bolted upright, her throat dry with fear. The sound was coming from inside. Scratching. A faint giggle. She grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and approached the closet with hesitant steps. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the doorknob. A deep breath. She flung the door open. The doll sat at the very edge of the shelf, its lifeless eyes locked onto hers. It had moved. Marissa's pulse pounded in her ears. This wasn't possible. Dolls didn't move. Dolls didn't whisper. "It's just my imagination," she told herself. But she didn't believe it. She grabbed the doll, stuffing it inside a shoebox, then shoved the box deep under her bed. Out of sight, out of mind. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had done something terribly wrong. At midnight, She woke to a sound that froze her blood. The shoebox was shaking. Marissa clutched her blanket, paralyzed with fear. The box rattled violently, thumping against the wooden floor. Then silence. Her breath came in short gasps. Minutes passed. Then scratch. From inside the box. Slow. Deliberate. Scratch. Scratch. A tiny giggle. Marissa leapt from her bed, grabbing the shoebox with trembling hands and rushing to the front door. She had to get rid of it. She yanked open the door and ran outside, the cold night air biting at her skin. Without hesitation, she hurled the box into the dumpster. It landed with a hollow thud. She waited, listened. Silence. With a deep breath, she backed away, slamming the door behind her. It was over, or so she thought. That night, she slept soundly for the first time in days. The relief washed over her, easing the tension in her muscles. But at 3:12 a.m., she awoke with a start. Her room was unbearably cold. Something was wrong. Her breath hitched as she turned her head ever so slightly. The closet door was open, and sitting on her bedside table, hands neatly folded in its lap, was the doll. Only this time, it wasn't whispering. It was smiling. Marissa couldn't move. Her body refused to obey her mind's desperate pleas. Cold, invisible fingers seemed to wrap around her throat, pressing down ever so lightly, a silent warning. And then, a breath. Not her own. Warm. Damp. Right against her ear. "Let me out." The voice was no longer coming from the doll. It was behind her. The scream that tore from Marissa's throat was lost in the night. The neighbors heard nothing. No one came. By morning, her apartment was empty. The bed was unmade, the door locked from the inside. And on the bedside table, waiting patiently, sat the porcelain doll. Smiling, waiting for someone else to bring it home. It was a dreary afternoon when Jake happened upon the small yard sale tucked away on the outskirts of town. He hadn't intended to stop, but the smell of musty old books and faded memories lured him in. The sale was quiet, with only a few people lingering over items long forgotten. An elderly woman, hunched over and draped in a faded shawl, sat behind a small table piled high with trinkets, old clocks, tarnished silverware, and boxes of dust-covered books. Jake had been searching for something, a rare book, perhaps, or a memento of some kind. But instead, his eyes fell upon something unexpected, a leather-bound photo album. It was old, its edges frayed and the cover cracked, as if it had been neglected for years. The pages inside were yellowed, their once bright colors now muted by time. The woman, sensing his interest, looked up and smiled faintly. "That one's been with me a long time," she said in a soft voice, almost as if she were speaking to herself. Jake flipped open the album without hesitation. The first few photos were of a family, smiling faces, sunlit afternoons, children playing in the yard. They seemed normal. But as he turned each page, the photos became increasingly eerie. The images of the people grew distant, their faces blurry, their smiles too wide, too forced. But what unsettled him most was something else entirely. In every single photo, there was a shadowy figure lurking in the background. At first, it was distant, barely noticeable, like a silhouette against a fading sunset. But as Jake continued to flip through the pages, the figure seemed to grow closer, creeping into each new photograph. By the time Jake reached the final page, he felt a chill settle deep in his bones. The shadowy figure was now closer than ever, its outline almost distinguishable, tall, thin, and unnaturally dark. It stood at the edge of the last photograph, its eyes hidden beneath the brim of a hat. The page itself, however, was blank. "What's this?" Jake muttered to himself, turning the page again, hoping for some kind of explanation. But there was nothing, just the empty page. The elderly woman watched him with a knowing gaze, her eyes flickering with something almost like sadness. "Not all memories are meant to be remembered," she whispered, almost too quietly for him to hear. "Some things they follow." Jake felt a shiver run down his spine, but he dismissed it as nothing more than his imagination playing tricks. He paid the woman a few dollars, eager to leave with his strange purchase, and made his way home. That night, as Jake lay in bed, the room eerily quiet except for the occasional creak of the house settling, he was suddenly roused by the sharp, unmistakable sound of a camera shutter clicking. His eyes snapped open, heart pounding. The room was dark, save for the dim light from the street lamp outside that filtered through his curtains. He glanced around, expecting to see the familiar outline of his furniture, his bedroom, but there was something strange, an unnatural stillness in the air. The sound of the camera shutter clicked again. Jake sat up in bed, sweat prickling on his skin. His breath quickened, his eyes darting to the corner of the room where he knew his dresser stood. Nothing. He told himself it was a dream, some lingering image from the strange album still in his mind. But then he heard it again, the click of a camera. This time it was followed by a faint rustling, as if something, or someone, was moving in the room. With trembling hands, he reached for the light on his nightstand, flicking it on. The room appeared as it always had. No one there, just the quiet hum of the city outside. Reluctantly, Jake lay back down, but the unsettling feeling didn't fade. Sleep eluded him, and his mind replayed the album over and over, the shadowy figure getting closer and closer in each picture. When Jake awoke the next morning, the sun had barely begun to rise, casting long shadows across the room. He rubbed his eyes and stretched, then froze. The photo album was on the nightstand. It wasn't there the night before. He had left it on the kitchen table, hadn't he? His heart skipped a beat as he reached for it, fear creeping up his spine. He opened the album, flipping to the last page, expecting to see the blank space he had seen the night before. But instead, there was a new photo. It was a picture of him. Jake's heart nearly stopped as he stared at the image. There he was, lying in his bed, fast asleep, his face peaceful in the quiet darkness of the room. But in the background, just at the edge of the frame, stood the shadowy figure. It was no longer a distant silhouette. It was right there, looming over him, its eyes glowing faintly beneath the brim of its hat. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He turned the page again. The next photograph was even worse. The figure was closer now, almost standing at the foot of his bed, its long fingers stretching toward him. His hands shook as he turned to the next page, only there were no more photographs. The final page was blank once more, but Jake could feel the weight of the figure's presence, as if it was watching him through the very pages of the album. That night, the camera shutter clicked again. This time, Jake didn't wait to see what happened. He leapt from his bed, heart hammering, and rushed to the living room, where he grabbed his phone and dialed the first number that came to his mind. "Hey, it's Jake. Something's happening. I don't know what it is, but I need you to." The call cut off suddenly. He looked down at the phone, blinking in confusion. The screen was cracked. When the police arrived the next morning, they found Jake's apartment exactly as he had left it. But Jake was gone. There was no trace of him, not a single clue as to where he had gone or what had happened to him. The album, however, remained on the nightstand, its pages now filled with a new photograph. Jake, standing at the edge of the apartment doorway, looking back one last time, the shadowy figure standing just behind him, its eyes now visible and wide with malice. The album was never seen again. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when Emily stumbled upon the small yard sale on the corner of Maple and Oak. The houses in the neighborhood were old, their foundations settled long ago, and the trees whispered in the wind as if speaking of secrets long forgotten. She hadn't meant to stop, but there was something about the sale that piqued her curiosity. The vendor, an elderly man with thin gray hair and a stooped back, sat behind a table cluttered with trinkets, faded books, chipped teacups, tarnished silver spoons. Emily ran her fingers over a few items, her gaze landing on an ornate, antique music box. It was small, carved from dark wood with delicate designs etched into its surface. The lid was adorned with a small brass latch, and beneath it, a tiny ballerina stood frozen in time, her arms raised in an elegant pose. "Ah, that one's a special piece," the elderly man said, noticing her interest. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes gleaming with something akin to nostalgia. "It's been in my family for generations, but it hasn't been played in years. Emily felt an odd pull towards the music box, as if it called to her in some quiet way. She glanced at the price tag and, with a shrug, decided it was worth the small sum he was asking. That evening, as Emily settled into her quiet apartment, she found herself mesmerized by the music box. Its surface was polished and smooth under her fingertips as she gently lifted the lid. She wound the small key on the side and waited. The sound that emerged was delicate at first, soft notes that seemed to float through the air like a lullaby. The melody was beautiful, yet there was something haunting about it, something that stirred a feeling of unease deep in her chest. As the song played, Emily felt her eyelids grow heavy, but she forced herself to stay awake. When the last note faded into silence, she was about to close the lid when a soft whisper came from within the box. "Play it again, or I wake up." Her breath caught in her throat. She looked down at the box, wide-eyed. Had she imagined that? It had to be a trick of the wind or her tired mind playing games with her. But the words were so clear. "Play it again, or I wake up." Shaking her head, Emily quickly closed the lid. She sat back in her chair, her pulse quickening. It was just a piece of music, nothing more. A simple, old-fashioned music box. She forced a laugh, telling herself that she had been hearing things. She had been tired all day. With the lid securely closed, she placed the box on her dresser and went to bed, trying to push the strange whisper from her mind. But sleep was slow to come, the eerie melody echoing in her thoughts, even after the music had stopped. That night, Emily awoke to the sound of the music box playing. The soft, familiar tune filled the room, its notes floating through the darkened apartment as if the box were alive. Her heart pounded in her chest as she sat up in bed, her eyes wide in disbelief. The music box, it was playing by itself. Frozen in place, Emily listened to the lullaby echo through the room, each note piercing the silence of the night. The ballerina inside the box, though still, seemed to sway with the rhythm of the tune. She couldn't tear her eyes away. And then, just as she was about to rise and check on the box, a soft giggle echoed from the darkness. A child's laughter. It was faint at first, like the distant sound of a playful child, but as the seconds stretched on, it grew louder. Emily's breath quickened. The laugh wasn't coming from outside her window or from the street. It was here, in her apartment. Her eyes darted around the room. The darkness seemed to press in on her, thick and oppressive. She strained her ears, trying to pinpoint the source of the laughter, but it was everywhere. It echoed off the walls, in the corners of the room, and within her own mind. The music played on, its haunting melody never faltering, while the laughter grew louder still. Emily's legs trembled as she pulled the covers tightly around her, but she couldn't move. The voice came again, this time clearer, more insistent. "Play it again, or I wake up." Emily's heart nearly stopped. It wasn't her mind playing tricks on her. This was real. The music box, with its soft, familiar lullaby, was calling her to it. She had to play it again. With a sense of dread creeping up her spine, she forced herself to her feet. The laughter had stopped, but the weight of its presence lingered in the air. Emily stepped slowly towards the dresser, her eyes fixed on the music box, which now sat eerily still. She could feel it, an almost palpable pull, urging her to wind it once more. Her fingers shook as she reached for the key. She wound it, feeling the resistance of the spring as it clicked into place. The moment the key stopped turning, the music began once more, the lullaby filling the room like an old memory. But the moment the melody began, the laughter returned. This time it was louder, closer, more frantic. A child's laughter, joyful, yet filled with something darker, something more sinister. Emily stumbled back, her heart pounding as she tried to force herself to move, but the music, the laughter, and the pull of the box kept her frozen in place. Then she saw it, the ballerina inside the box. Her porcelain face was no longer serene. Her eyes were wide open, staring straight at Emily. And beneath the soft tinkling of the lullaby, the sound of breathing, soft, slow, deep, could be heard, coming from within the box. "Play it again," the voice whispered, this time with a growing sense of urgency. "Or I wake up." With her mind spinning, Emily slammed the lid shut, cutting off the music, the laughter, and the whisper. Silence descended upon the room. She collapsed onto the bed, gasping for breath, her hands trembling as she clutched the sheets. She didn't know how much time passed, but when she finally dared to open her eyes, the music box was on the floor beside her bed. The lid was open, and the ballerina, once frozen in place, was gone. The next morning, Emily found the music box still beside her bed. The lid was closed. When she opened it, the ballerina was back, poised as though nothing had happened. But as she stood there, staring at the box, she heard it. The soft giggle of a child. And the lullaby began again. Lena had always been drawn to vintage items, and when she saw the mannequin at the antique market, she couldn't resist. It was beautiful, crafted from smooth, pale wood with a soft, faded finish that gave it an air of elegance. The mannequin's painted eyes, however, were what intrigued her most. They were unnervingly lifelike, too detailed, too perfect, as though they were always watching her, regardless of the angle. The seller had warned her in a quiet voice, almost a whisper, "Be careful. It's not just for display." But Lena laughed it off, dismissing the warning as mere superstition. She was a businesswoman, after all, and she knew this mannequin would make a perfect addition to her boutique. That night, after closing her shop, Lena brought the mannequin to her apartment. She carefully set it up near the window, its stiff figure poised in the corner, its painted eyes staring out into the dimly lit room. She glanced at it one last time before heading to bed, but the sight of the mannequin's gaze lingered in her mind long after she had turned off the lights. Around midnight, the soft shuffling sounds began. Lena's eyes fluttered open, her heart racing. She sat up, straining her ears to listen. The sound was faint but unmistakable, the slow scrape of something moving against the floor. She looked around her dark bedroom, but there was nothing out of place. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her mind told her it was just her imagination, a trick of the night. But when she rose to check, she froze in her tracks. The mannequin was gone. She rushed into the next room, heart pounding in her chest, but found only the faint outline of the mannequin's figure near the window, its shadow now cast across the room like a ghost. It had moved. Her breath caught in her throat as she examined the mannequin's new position, now facing the door, its painted eyes staring directly at her. She didn't remember leaving it like that. Lena couldn't explain it, but the unease crept over her. The mannequin's eyes, they were different. Cold, too real, as though it had been watching her the entire time. She tried to rationalize the situation, dismissing it as her tired mind playing tricks. Perhaps she had moved it earlier and forgotten, or maybe it had shifted slightly on its own. She had heard of strange things happening with old furniture. Perhaps the joints were loose. Still, she couldn't ignore the creeping sensation that something was deeply wrong. The next night, Lena locked up the boutique early, determined to get a good night's sleep. She made sure to secure all the windows and doors, convinced that there was no reason for anything to happen again. But when she woke the next morning, she found the mannequin standing at the foot of her bed. Lena gasped, her heart skipping a beat. The mannequin, which she had left near the window just hours before, was now eerily positioned in her bedroom. Its lifeless eyes stared down at her, its head tilted slightly as though it were observing her in the darkness. Panic rose in her chest. She had locked up the boutique. She had double-checked everything. There was no way the mannequin could have made its way into her bedroom on its own. She quickly rushed around the room, checking the locks, the windows, even under the bed, as if she might find an explanation for the strange occurrence. But there was none. She was alone in the apartment, yet the mannequin was there, unnervingly out of place. Lena tried to shake the unease, but the sight of those painted eyes staring at her was too much. She couldn't rationalize it anymore. Something was happening, something that she couldn't explain. The mannequin wasn't just an object, it was alive. It was aware. The third night, Lena had had enough. She set up cameras, determined to find out if her mind was playing tricks on her or if something truly unnatural was happening. She positioned the cameras around the boutique, hoping to capture any movement, any sign of what was going on. She spent the entire night pacing, waiting, watching the footage on her phone. The stillness of the shop was unsettling, the dim light from the cameras casting long shadows across the room. Then, at exactly 3:17 a.m., something changed. The mannequin's head began to turn. Slowly, methodically, its wooden neck creaking with each movement, until its eyes were directly facing the camera. Lena's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the screen, unable to tear her eyes away. The mannequin's head tilted, and for a brief moment, she could almost swear that the eyes glimmered. Then, to her horror, the mannequin's lips parted, and a whisper escaped from its painted mouth. "Lena." The voice was low and soft, a faint rasping sound that sent a chill down her spine. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. The mannequin had spoken her name. Lena's heart raced as she scrambled to pause the video, but the footage continued, showing the mannequin slowly turning its head back to face the rest of the room. The eyes remained locked on her, even as the camera moved to follow its movements. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as though the mannequin were trying to speak, trying to be heard. "Play with me, Lena," it whispered again, its voice growing stronger, more insistent. Lena's pulse pounded in her ears as she stared at the screen, her entire body frozen in fear. There was no explanation, no logical reason for this. The mannequin was alive, aware, and it wanted something from her, something she didn't understand. With a trembling hand, Lena turned off the cameras, but she could still hear the voice echoing in her mind, the whispering words, the soft clicking of the mannequin's joints. It was as if the mannequin's gaze had followed her out of the room, lingering in the dark corners of her mind. Lena never returned to her boutique. The mannequin, now a cursed relic of the past, sat silently in the corner of the shop, its painted eyes always watching. And those who ventured close could still hear its whisper on the wind, calling for someone to come and play. Ethan had never been one to resist the allure of old things. To him, antique stores and garage sales were like treasure hunts, filled with oddities waiting to be discovered. It was on one of these hunts, one gray Saturday morning, that he stumbled across something that would change his life forever. A weathered grandfather clock stood in the corner of a cluttered garage sale, its wooden frame scratched and chipped by time. The clock's hands, however, caught Ethan's attention immediately. They were moving in reverse. He stepped closer, inspecting it with curiosity. It was a magnificent piece, despite its age. The brass pendulum swung back and forth, ticking rhythmically, but the hands of the clock turned counterclockwise, defying everything Ethan knew about timepieces. That clock! The seller, an elderly man with a distant look in his eyes, muttered from across the yard. "It resets time, at a cost." Ethan, not one to shy away from the unknown, was intrigued. "What do you mean by resets time?" he asked, his voice laced with skepticism. The seller's lips curled into a faint smile, but his eyes remained shadowed, as though something dark lurked behind them. "It turns back time, but be careful. Time is not something to tamper with." Ethan chuckled, dismissing the old man's cryptic words. "I'll take it." The clock was his for a small sum, and he hurried home with it, excited to see if there was any truth to the old man's words. As he set it up in his living room, the clock continued to tick backward, each second more surreal than the last. Ethan's fascination grew. That night, he couldn't resist. He reached over and turned the clock's hands back by 1 hour. At first, nothing happened. The room remained still, the usual sounds of the night surrounding him. But then, as the evening wore on, Ethan began to notice something odd. Conversations seemed to repeat themselves. The neighbor's voice calling from the street below, the faint sound of the television show he had been watching moments earlier. It was as if time had rewound itself. Even his own movements seemed to be mirrored in perfect repetition. A mistake he had made while typing on his phone? It happened again, exactly as before. He was thrilled. The clock worked. He had reset time, even if only by an hour. The power to undo moments, to relive them, was intoxicating. Eager for more, Ethan decided to push his experiment further. The next night, he turned the clock back further. 2 hours, then 3. At first, the results were the same. Events repeated, conversations looped. But as he continued to manipulate time, Ethan began to feel a subtle unease. He noticed that as the days passed, his reflection in the mirror seemed different. The lines on his face deepened, his hair began to gray, and his eyes seemed duller, as though the very passage of time had begun to consume him. Yet, when he looked at himself in the mirror, he remained unchanged. His face was youthful, his hair thick and dark, his body just as it had been. It was as if time was passing him by, but only for his reflection. The unease grew. Ethan began to avoid mirrors, uncomfortable with the way his reflection had started to age while he remained the same. Each glance into the glass showed an image of himself that he no longer recognized, an image that seemed to mock him. But despite the growing dread, he couldn't stop. The power of the clock, the ability to rewind time, kept him captivated. He had control over his reality. He could fix his mistakes, erase awkward moments, and relive the best parts of his day. That is, until the night when everything changed. Ethan awoke in the dark hours of the morning, his body frozen in place. His limbs felt as if they were made of stone, unable to move or even twitch. His breath came in shallow gasps, his heart pounding in his chest. Panic gripped him, but he couldn't break free from the paralysis that had overtaken him. It was then that he saw it. In the mirror across from his bed, his reflection smirked. Ethan's eyes widened in horror as he saw his own image grin at him, a wicked, malicious smile spreading across his face. It was a smile that wasn't his, a smile that was born from something darker. His reflection, no longer a mere copy of himself, seemed to have a life of its own. "Your time is up," the reflection whispered, its voice low and hollow. The words sent a chill through Ethan's bones, as though the air had turned to ice. His mind raced as he struggled to comprehend what was happening. He had rewound time so many times, meddled with it as if it were nothing more than a toy, a plaything to bend and break. But now, time was no longer his to control. He had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The reflection in the mirror leaned closer, its smile widening with every passing second. Ethan tried to scream, to move, to do anything, but his body remained paralyzed. The room felt colder now, the shadows thicker, as though something ancient and malevolent was closing in. The reflection raised its hand, its fingers curling as if to reach out through the glass. Time always takes its toll. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, his heart racing faster with every passing second. The reflection stepped closer to the mirror, its eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. With a final, sinister laugh, the reflection spoke again. "You should have stopped when you had the chance." As Ethan's mind spun in terror, he could feel it. The clock had taken its cost. Time had claimed him, and now his reflection, his very soul, was lost to it. He was trapped in the moment, caught between the hours he had stolen and the price he had paid for them. The last thing Ethan saw before the darkness closed in was his reflection, its eyes burning with the triumph of a power far greater than his own. Claire had always been a fan of thrift store shopping. She relished the thrill of finding forgotten treasures, the promise of discovering something with a history, a story buried beneath layers of dust and neglect. It was during one of her weekend excursions to a yard sale in the quiet suburbs that she found the dress. It was a wedding dress, an old one, worn and weathered by time. The fabric, once white, had yellowed with age, and the lace was frayed at the edges. The satin skirt was crinkled, as though it had been stored away hastily. It looked like something from another time, a relic from a forgotten wedding day. Despite its imperfections, Claire felt a pull, a magnetic attraction to the dress. The seller, a frail woman with pale, tired eyes, had warned her in a quiet voice, "It's an old thing, dear. It carries the weight of a broken day. I'd be careful if I were you." Claire smiled, dismissing the woman's words as nothing more than a superstitious tale. She had always been skeptical of warnings like these. "I'll take it," Claire said, handing over the money. As she walked away with the dress, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was just a dress, after all. What harm could it do? That evening, Claire stood before the mirror in her bedroom, holding the dress up to her body. She was excited to try it on, imagining how she might wear it to a themed event or perhaps for a creative photo shoot. But as soon as she slipped it over her head, something strange washed over her. A wave of sorrow, deep and suffocating, gripped her heart. It wasn't just a fleeting sadness. It was a profound, aching sorrow that seemed to come from within the very fabric of the dress itself. Claire stood still, her hand pressed to her chest, as tears filled her eyes. She wasn't sure why, but she felt as though she had been transported to another place, another time, one filled with grief and regret. She quickly pulled the dress off, her breath ragged as she tried to shake off the strange feeling that lingered. That night, Claire fell into an uneasy sleep. Her dreams were strange, dark, heavy with a sense of foreboding. She dreamed of a bride, standing alone in a desolate place. The woman was wearing a wedding dress, just like the one Claire had found, but it was torn and stained, the once beautiful fabric now ragged and worn. The bride's face was pale and her eyes, empty, hollow, stared out into nothingness. She was weeping, her sobs echoing through the empty space. Claire tried to approach her, but the woman's voice stopped her. "You stole my day," she whispered, her voice trembling with sorrow. Claire woke with a start, her heart racing. She was covered in sweat, the sheets tangled around her body. The room was silent, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on her nightstand. She glanced at the dress, now lying forgotten at the foot of her bed. The feeling of dread from the dream still clung to her, and for a moment, she wondered if it was just a nightmare. But the sorrow in the dream had felt too real, too intense to be dismissed so easily. The next morning, Claire woke to find the dress soaked, as though it had been drenched in water. It lay in a heap on the floor, its once yellowed fabric now darker, stained with what appeared to be tears. She bent down, her fingers trembling as she touched the fabric. The material was wet, cold to the touch, and as she ran her fingers over it, she could feel a faint, unsettling chill crawling up her arm. Her heart skipped a beat as she pulled the dress up, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling of unease in her chest. The sensation of sorrow, the deep ache that had gripped her the night before, returned. It was as if the dress itself carried the grief of the bride in the dream, an unspoken pain that Claire couldn't escape. She thought about throwing it away, disposing of it once and for all. But somehow, she couldn't bring herself to do it. She folded the dress neatly and placed it on the bed, unsure of what to do next. It was just a dress, after all. And yet it felt wrong, haunted even. The days that followed were filled with strange occurrences. The dreams became more vivid, more terrifying. Each night, Claire found herself trapped in a new, twisted vision of the bride. She saw her walking down a lonely, dimly lit hallway, her face still pale, her eyes empty, as she whispered, "You stole my day," over and over. The sadness in her voice was deafening. Claire tried to tell herself it was just a dream, that it was nothing more than her imagination running wild. But each morning, she awoke with the same feeling, the same overwhelming sorrow that weighed her down. And then one evening, she decided to do what she should have done long ago. She would throw the dress away. It had to be the dress, the source of the strange happenings, the source of the grief that had taken root inside her. But when she went to her bedroom to dispose of it, she froze. The dress was gone. Her heart pounded in her chest as she searched the room frantically. The dress wasn't anywhere to be found. It wasn't in the closet, it wasn't under the bed. She stood in the middle of the room, her mind racing. Had someone taken it? Had she misplaced it? But then, she turned toward the bed. The dress was neatly folded at the foot of the bed, just as it had been the first time. The wet fabric glistened faintly in the moonlight that filtered through the window. The dress, was it smiling? Or was it simply the way the folds of the fabric lay? Claire's breath hitched as she stared at it, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. And then, in the mirror across the room, she saw her. The bride, standing behind her, her hollow eyes fixed on Claire. But this time, the bride wasn't weeping. She was smiling, her lips stretched in an unnatural grin, her face contorted with something far worse than sorrow. "You stole my day," she whispered, her voice now echoing in the room, filling Claire's mind with an overwhelming sense of dread. Claire screamed, stumbling backward, her heart racing in her chest. The bride's smile widened, and for the first time Claire understood. The sorrow, the anger, the grief, it wasn't just the dress. It was the bride, and Claire had become part of her story. And now, the day she had stolen would be hers to relive forever. Ethan had never been one to resist the allure of old things. To him, antique stores and garage sales were like treasure hunts, filled with oddities waiting to be discovered. It was on one of these hunts, one gray Saturday morning, that he stumbled across something that would change his life forever. A weathered grandfather clock stood in the corner of a cluttered garage sale, its wooden frame scratched and chipped by time. The clock's hands, however, caught Ethan's attention immediately. They were moving in reverse. He stepped closer, inspecting it with curiosity. It was a magnificent piece, despite its age. The brass pendulum swung back and forth, ticking rhythmically, but the hands of the clock turned counterclockwise, defying everything Ethan knew about timepieces. That clock! The seller, an elderly man with a distant look in his eyes, muttered from across the yard. It resets time. At a cost. Ethan, not one to shy away from the unknown, was intrigued. "What do you mean by resets time?" he asked, his voice laced with skepticism. The seller's lips curled into a faint smile, but his eyes remained shadowed, as though something dark lurked behind them. "It turns back time, but be careful. Time is not something to tamper with." Ethan chuckled, dismissing the old man's cryptic words. "I'll take it." The clock was his for a small sum, and he hurried home with it, excited to see if there was any truth to the old man's words. As he set it up in his living room, the clock continued to tick backward, each second more surreal than the last. Ethan's fascination grew. That night, he couldn't resist. He reached over and turned the clock's hands back by 1 hour. At first, nothing happened. The room remained still, the usual sounds of the night surrounding him. But then, as the evening wore on, Ethan began to notice something odd. Conversations seemed to repeat themselves. The neighbor's voice calling from the street below, the faint sound of the television show he had been watching moments earlier. It was as if time had rewound itself. Even his own movements seemed to be mirrored in perfect repetition. A mistake he had made while typing on his phone? It happened again, exactly as before. He was thrilled. The clock worked. He had reset time, even if only by an hour. The power to undo moments, to relive them, was intoxicating. Eager for more, Ethan decided to push his experiment further. The next night, he turned the clock back further. 2 hours, then 3. At first, the results were the same. Events repeated, conversations looped. But as he continued to manipulate time, Ethan began to feel a subtle unease. He noticed that, as the days passed, his reflection in the mirror seemed different. The lines on his face deepened, his hair began to gray, and his eyes seemed duller, as though the very passage of time had begun to consume him. Yet, when he looked at himself in the mirror, he remained unchanged. His face was youthful, his hair thick and dark, his body just as it had been. It was as if time was passing him by, but only for his reflection. The unease grew. Ethan began to avoid mirrors, uncomfortable with the way his reflection had started to age while he remained the same. Each glance into the glass showed an image of himself that he no longer recognized, an image that seemed to mock him. But despite the growing dread, he couldn't stop. The power of the clock, the ability to rewind time, kept him captivated. He had control over his reality. He could fix his mistakes, erase awkward moments, and relive the best parts of his day. That is, until the night when everything changed. Ethan awoke in the dark hours of the morning, his body frozen in place. His limbs felt as if they were made of stone, unable to move or even twitch. His breath came in shallow gasps, his heart pounding in his chest. Panic gripped him, but he couldn't break free from the paralysis that had overtaken him. It was then that he saw it. In the mirror across from his bed, his reflection smirked. Ethan's eyes widened in horror as he saw his own image grin at him, a wicked, malicious smile spreading across his face. It was a smile that wasn't his, a smile that was born from something darker. His reflection, no longer a mere copy of himself, seemed to have a life of its own. "Your time is up," the reflection whispered, its voice low and hollow. The words sent a chill through Ethan's bones, as though the air had turned to ice. His mind raced as he struggled to comprehend what was happening. He had rewound time so many times, meddled with it as if it were nothing more than a toy, a plaything to bend and break. But now, time was no longer his to control. He had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The reflection in the mirror leaned closer, its smile widening with every passing second. Ethan tried to scream, to move, to do anything, but his body remained paralyzed. The room felt colder now, the shadows thicker, as though something ancient and malevolent was closing in. The reflection raised its hand, its fingers curling as if to reach out through the glass. Time always takes its toll. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, his heart racing faster with every passing second. The reflection stepped closer to the mirror, its eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. With a final, sinister laugh, the reflection spoke again. "You should have stopped when you had the chance." As Ethan's mind spun in terror, he could feel it. The clock had taken its cost. Time had claimed him, and now his reflection, his very soul, was lost to it. He was trapped in the moment, caught between the hours he had stolen and the price he had paid for them. The last thing Ethan saw before the darkness closed in was his reflection, its eyes burning with the triumph of a power far greater than his own. Megan had always been drawn to oddities, those strange, unsettling objects that seemed to possess an air of mystery. It was at a quiet yard sale, nestled on the edge of a forgotten street, that she came across the most peculiar item of all, a small wooden box. It was nothing remarkable in appearance. The wood was dark and weathered, its surface marked by time's inevitable touch. Yet there was something undeniably captivating about it, something that tugged at her curiosity. What intrigued her most, however, was the fact that it had no keyhole, no visible way to open it. Just a simple, unadorned box, locked without any means of unlocking. "How much for this?" she asked the elderly woman behind the table, her voice light with polite interest. The woman, her eyes clouded by age and sorrow, looked at the box with a strange, guarded expression. "It's not for sale," she muttered, her voice low and distant, as if speaking to herself. "It should never have been sold." Megan raised an eyebrow, but the woman's words barely registered. "How much?" she repeated, a sense of insistence creeping into her voice. The elderly woman hesitated, then sighed. $1, she said, almost reluctantly. Megan handed over the money, feeling an odd thrill as the woman passed her the box. She didn't fully understand why she felt such a strong pull toward it, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it was meant for her. Something about it, something unspoken, beckoned her to take it. The box was small enough to fit in her hands, and Megan spent the next few hours turning it over, examining it from every angle. The wood was smooth, its grain soft beneath her fingertips, but there was no keyhole, no way to open it. No locks, no hinges. It was as if it had been sealed by some unknown force, its contents hidden from the world. That evening, as she placed it on her bedside table, she noticed something strange, a faint scratching sound emanating from inside. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, like the gentle rustling of leaves in the wind. But as the night wore on, the scratching grew louder, more persistent, as if something inside the box was trying to escape. Megan frowned, her brow furrowing with unease. She tried to ignore it, chalking it up to her imagination. But as the night deepened, the scratching continued, sharp and frantic, clawing at the wooden walls of the box. It was as if the thing inside was desperate, frantic to get out. Megan's heart raced in her chest, her fingers trembling as she tried to drown out the noise. But it only grew louder, more frantic, until she could barely hear her own thoughts. The next day, Megan returned home after work to find the box exactly where she had left it. She couldn't remember ever hearing the scratching stop, but now it was eerily silent. Hesitantly, she reached for the box, her hand hovering just above it. A sense of dread washed over her, yet she felt compelled to touch it, to feel the mysterious presence inside. That's when she noticed the note. It was tucked beneath the box, folded carefully in half as if it had been placed there deliberately. Megan's breath caught in her throat as she picked it up. The paper yellowed with age, the writing faded but legible. "Do not open," it read in jagged, uneven script. It was never meant to be unlocked. Megan's fingers trembled as she read the note again, her heart pounding in her chest. The words felt wrong, almost as if they were meant to warn her from something she had already set in motion. She stared at the box for a long time, torn between her overwhelming curiosity and the growing sense of fear that gnawed at her gut. But the urge to open it was too strong. She couldn't stop herself. That night, as Megan lay in bed, she heard the faint scratching once again. It was the same as before, desperate, clawing at the wooden sides of the box. But this time, something was different. The scratching wasn't the only sound. There was something else, a faint rustling that seemed to come from the box itself. Something was moving inside, something that didn't belong. She glanced at the box, her heart in her throat. The lid, once sealed tight, was now slightly ajar. The tiniest of gaps had formed, just enough for Megan to see the darkness inside. For a moment, she lay frozen in bed, her mind racing with possibilities. Should she look? Should she open it? The note had warned her, but the fear of what was inside, the fear of never knowing, was too much. Slowly, she reached for the box. But as her fingers brushed the lid, the scratching stopped. A deep, eerie silence filled the room, and Megan's breath caught in her chest. She pulled her hand back, her eyes wide with terror. Something was watching her. She could feel it. Then, as if on cue, she heard it. Breathing. It was faint at first, like the soft exhale of someone just out of reach. But it grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable, sharp, ragged breaths coming from right beside her bed. Her heart raced as she slowly turned her head, her eyes darting around the room. There was no one there. No one in the room, no movement, just the sound of that horrible, labored breathing coming from the very air around her. She sat up, her body trembling. The breath grew louder, more desperate. It was right next to her, so close she could feel the warmth of it against her skin. But when she turned to look, nothing was there, just the cold, empty shadows of her room. And then the breathing stopped. A silence fell over the room, thick and suffocating. Megan's heart pounded in her chest, her blood running cold as she glanced once more at the box. The lid had opened further. She couldn't stay there. The room felt wrong, the very air thick with the presence of something unseen, something that was no longer confined to the box. With a scream lodged in her throat, Megan bolted from the bed, running from the room as fast as her legs could carry her. But as she reached the door, she heard it again, those breathless whispers, just behind her, coming from the shadows. "You opened it," and the scratching began once again. David was no stranger to the strange allure of forgotten objects. A lover of antiques, he spent hours hunting for hidden treasures in estate sales, rummaging through boxes of old books, furniture, and trinkets, seeking the stories that clung to them like dust. One particular estate sale, however, would change the course of his life. The house, though grand in its time, now stood in silent decay. Its walls sagged with age, the floors creaked underfoot, and the air seemed thick with the memories of those long gone. As David wandered through the rooms, his eyes landed on a small, antique wooden cradle. It was finely crafted, with intricate carvings of flowers and vines that seemed to dance across its surface. Though it appeared simple at first glance, there was something about the cradle that tugged at his heart, a feeling he couldn't quite explain. He hesitated for a moment, but then, unable to resist, he approached the seller, a frail, elderly woman who stood by the door, her hands trembling slightly. "How much for the cradle?" David asked, his voice laced with curiosity. The woman's eyes flickered to the cradle, then back to him, her expression unreadable. After a pause, she spoke in a voice that seemed to carry a weight of warning. "It's not for sale," she muttered, almost too softly for him to hear. David's eyebrows furrowed. "Why not?" he pressed, his fingers brushing the smooth wood of the cradle. "It's a beautiful piece." The old woman's eyes hardened, but her voice remained calm. "It was never meant to be moved. It waits for someone." David, intrigued by her cryptic words, smiled and shrugged. "I'll take it anyway," he said, a slight laugh escaping his lips. The woman's warning lingered in the air, but it didn't deter him. That evening, he placed the cradle in his bedroom, admiring its craftsmanship. It seemed out of place in his modern apartment, but there was something about it that felt strangely comforting. As he settled into bed, he noticed the soft creaking sound coming from the cradle. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, like the sound of someone gently rocking it. David glanced at the cradle, his heart skipping a beat. The room was still, the air thick with silence. He stood up and walked over to it, only to find it perfectly still. The creaking had ceased. With a sigh of relief, he shook his head, dismissing the strange sound as nothing more than his imagination. But that night, as he lay in bed, the creaking returned. This time it was louder, more insistent. The sound of wood groaning, as though a child was rocking in the cradle. His pulse quickened, and he stared at the empty cradle, his breath shallow. He got up once more and approached it, but again there was no sign of movement. The cradle was still. The following nights brought more of the same. The creaking, the whispering, the soft sounds of a child that seemed to come from nowhere. At first, David thought he was imagining things. Perhaps the house was simply old, the wood settling in the night. But the sounds grew stronger, more distinct. One evening, after hearing faint whispers and the unmistakable sound of a child's soft crying, David decided to investigate further. He stepped closer to the cradle, his eyes narrowing as he studied it. His fingers traced the intricate carvings on the wood, flowers and vines, just as they appeared before. But as he moved his hand along the surface, something caught his eye. A small, hidden carving in the wood near the bottom of the cradle read, "Still waiting for mother." David's heart froze. He felt a chill creep up his spine as the words etched themselves into his mind. Still waiting for mother. What did it mean? Who was the mother? And why had the words been carved so carefully, as if someone had intended for them to be found? The whispers continued that night, low and mournful, like the sound of a child who longed for something, or someone, that would never return. David's nerves were on edge, his mind racing with questions. But the most unsettling thing of all was the feeling that he was no longer alone in the room. The next night, as David lay in bed, the whispers returned, but this time they were different. There was something unmistakable about them, an intimacy, a closeness that made his skin crawl. He could hear the faint sound of breathing, steady and rhythmic, as though someone were standing at his bedside. But when he opened his eyes, the room was empty. Then he heard it, the voice clear as day, right beside his ear. "You'll do." David's heart slammed against his ribs as he sprang upright in bed, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The room was dark, the shadows heavy, but the voice still lingered in the air, as though it had never left. He turned his head, expecting to see something, anything, but the room remained empty. The cradle, however, was no longer where he had left it. It had shifted, turned slightly, as though it had moved on its own. He stumbled out of bed, his body trembling with a mix of fear and confusion. The whispers were now louder, more urgent, and the soft sound of a child's crying filled the air. It was coming from the cradle, coming from the very walls of the room. David took a step forward, his legs shaking beneath him. The air in the room was thick, heavy with a sense of dread that pressed in on him from all sides. He reached out, his hand trembling as it hovered over the cradle, but he couldn't bring himself to touch it. Something was wrong. Something had always been wrong. And then the voice came again, this time not in his ear, but in his mind. "You'll do," it whispered, the words laced with malice. David's breath caught in his throat as he realized the truth. The cradle wasn't empty. It had never been empty. And it was waiting, not for a mother, but for someone else. Someone like him. With a scream lodged in his throat, David turned and fled from the room, from the cradle, from the house. He never returned.